faithfully delivering value and exploring great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally Talking Books. The book we're discussing today is Plagues and Peoples, authored by William H. McNeill, the most renowned global history expert of our time. His works have shaped the historical views of generations of Western elites, and Plagues and Peoples is a key masterpiece, showcasing his global perspective on history. When you hear about plagues, you might feel disgust, thinking they only harm human health and life with no upside. But this book's author, American historian William H. McNeill, puts forth a fresh idea. Plagues are a fundamental parameter and decisive factor in human history and civilization's evolution. What does fundamental parameter and decisive factor mean? It means plagues aren't random, they're not trivial, and they won't vanish. Just like elements such as economy, war, and geography, they shape human civilization and keep impacting our world. If plagues are so crucial, why didn't historians before give them the recognition they deserve? Well, it's simple. Historians tend to favor the idea that history should be rational and follow patterns. Otherwise, they couldn't study or grasp it. But plagues are often unpredictable, popping in and out without warning. That leaves historians flustered, so they downplay or outright ignore it. Now, McNeill uses medical history methods to uncover how epidemic patterns have shaped history. That leads me to walk through this book along McNeill's line of thought. First, let's understand what plague actually is. To define it, plague is a widespread infectious disease caused by highly pathogenic microbes like bacteria and viruses, often leading to mass deaths. When did this terrifying thing start? Its emergence in human history traces back to agricultural societies. Back then, agricultural societies meant staying put on small plots of land, farming, and not moving around freely. Farmers lived clustered together long term, so when infections hit, they got infected easily. Because they couldn't roam freely like nomads, farmers' waste and refuse piled up fixedly around their homes. Take feces, for example. Increased human contact with feces means contaminated drinking water can transfer parasites carrying pathogenic microorganisms, causing illness. However, not every agricultural society experiences frequent plagues, and two essential factors enable plague outbreaks in human societies. First is complex ecosystems. Generally, lower temperatures reduce survival suitability, so tropical regions host more diverse species than temperate zones, creating complex ecologies ideal for pathogen-carrying parasites. In hot, humid climates like India and Africa, germs easily breed, fleas and bedbugs. These parasites host germs, while rodents and livestock host fleas and bedbugs. Human contact with these hosts enables transmission, facilitating plagues. Clear links exist between many human infectious diseases and those in poultry and livestock. We're familiar with avian flu and mad cow disease, which still frequently occur today. The second factor is dense populations, giving germs more opportunities to spread and find new hosts. The clearest evidence: infectious diseases spread faster between people, making outbreaks easier. Overall, plagues in human societies balance like a seesaw. Prosperity increases population beyond thresholds, triggering plagues that cause deaths. But drastic population declines eliminate hosts for plague microbes, ending outbreaks. Thus, after prolonged mutual adaptation, plagues in societies reach equilibrium, disrupted by conditions, then rebalanced through new adaptations. Throughout civilization's development, regional plague adaptations shaped distinct cultural traits. Now, let's examine plagues' impact on human societies chronologically. First, we'll explore how plagues affected the Middle East, China, India, and the Mediterranean between 500 BC and 1200 AD. How did these major cradles of civilization merge through cultural exchange? Why start from 500 BC? Because we're focusing on diseases that spread directly between humans. These are diseases of civilized societies that profoundly impact civilization, hence called diseases of civilization. Before 500 BC, civilization cradles were in early development, with plagues evolving into diseases of civilization. Around 500 BC, humans and civilization diseases reached a basic seesaw balance. What followed was the Great Convergence of disease zones. This process largely unfolded between 500 BC and 1200 AD. The Middle East, as civilization's earliest birthplace, achieved disease-human balance exceptionally early. By 500 BC, Middle Easterners understood recurring epidemics that periodically ravaged communities. Both Babylonian epics and the Jewish Bible contain extensive plague records. These plagues killed portions of the population, reducing density, yet not enough to cause crippling damage. Despite plagues, the Middle East still birthed mighty empires. This held for Babylon and Assyria. In China, plagues severely hindered early southern development, creating massive north-south imbalance. Logically, southern China had greater advantages. Warmer climate requiring less winter provisions, easier farming, shorter crop cycles, abundant water preventing droughts. So it should have developed earlier. Yet the Central Plains along the Yellow River became China's civilization cradle. Despite southern advantages, civilization expanded slower there. Yangtze River development lagged behind the Yellow River by a millennium. Not until the Sui Tang and Five Dynasties periods did southern China's economy surpass the North's. The powerful hindering factor, plagues. When Chinese pioneers moved south into fertile farmlands, they transitioned from cold regions where parasites died in winter to harsher disease environments. It's like climbing a ladder. The higher you go, the more diseases there are, and the harsher the living conditions. From the perspective of the disease ladder, the danger in southern China is far higher than in the north. No wonder ancient emperors exiled ministers they disliked to Lingnan, where they faced near certain death. Having covered the Middle East and China, let's look at India. The whole country has a similar climate, so the disease ladder isn't as steep as China's north-south divide. So where does plagues shaping power show? Plagues also had a profound impact on ancient Indian civilization. On one hand, it caused economic poverty. On the other, it led to social barriers and ideas of withdrawal and world weariness. Ancient Indian civilization formed in climates and disease environments unbearable to Chinese people. Even today, it's a hot spot for cholera, plague, and dengue fever, let alone centuries ago. Positively, people adapted to this environment could easily develop vast lands in Southeast Asia under similar harsh conditions. So between 100 BC and 500 AD, a greater India region formed, spanning vast territories. This included parts of Southeast Asia and Indonesian islands, but there was a downside. On this plague-prone land, once population hits a certain level, parasites multiply rapidly. Even for those long adapted, infectious diseases impose a heavy burden. Individuals' energy and stamina, along with societal productivity, are drained by plagues, hindering sustainable agricultural development. In ancient societies based on agriculture, low productivity made it hard to build strong nations. So, while India appeared wealthy, with a large population and consumption, this wealth was held only by the ruling class, leaving society weak. Moreover, rampant plagues shaped two distinct features in ancient Indian civilization. One is the caste system, a long-standing institution with strict segregation between castes. Higher castes avoid lower castes at all costs, with no direct physical contact like handshakes. This strange phenomenon is tied to the need to avoid infectious diseases. Those Aryans who invaded the Indian subcontinent became rulers. But if they had too much contact with local indigenous people, they could easily catch diseases and die. So, fearing infection, they created the caste system, labeling locals as untouchable low castes and strictly maintaining distance to protect their health. One consequence of this isolation, compared to northern Asian civilizations like China, Indian civilization has weaker cultural unity and social cohesion. Another feature is Indian religion's unique otherworldliness. This philosophy views life as suffering. Material pleasures and emotions are illusory and should be abandoned, desires suppressed, with only spiritual bliss pursued. It's hard to measure exactly how much plagues influence this, but roughly this ties into farmers being plagued by long-term poverty and disease. Easy to understand. Since life is so tough, what's the point of focusing on reality? See, plagues not only shape a civilization's productivity, but also its spiritual character. Compared to Chinese and Indian farmers' environments, ancient Mediterranean coastal life was far easier. Farmers here didn't focus on grain production, but bought food via trade from other Mediterranean areas. Local crops were mainly olive trees and grapes. Olive trees were common wild plants in Greece before human domestication. Grapes were indeed introduced elsewhere, but didn't disrupt Greece's ecological balance. Thus, unlike other civilizations, there was no drastic agricultural overhaul here. Plague intensity and persistence were much weaker. Thus, as civilization expanded along the Mediterranean coast, undeveloped areas were drier and colder than the Aegean region, effectively curbing disease spread and enabling, smooth population growth. So fewer plagues mean better living. This includes both India and the Mediterranean, as these four civilization zones gradually formed their own disease circles, each with unique epidemic patterns. They achieved internal balance. But once these diseases cross borders into another disease circle, it'll have a deadly impact.
Mhm.
When diseases are stuck in one area, it's not scary. What's scary is when they swap between different disease circles. So, how do they actually exchange? Who builds this bridge? Well, it's humans themselves. Think about it. A single group can't track thousands of miles to deliver the disease personally. It takes tons of travelers and susceptible folks spread out like a relay race along the whole infection chain to make it stick. Back then, the only ones pulling this off were trade caravans. Driven by chasing profits, expansion, and imperial rule, huge trade kicked off between Asia and Europe. The Silk Road, as we all know, was the most famous caravan, riding camels through grasslands and deserts, swapping goods and, yep, diseases too. Once a strange disease enters a new disease circle, it starts wreaking havoc on susceptible people right away. Facing plague, a region's most direct hit is that folks without resistance die off, leading to massive population loss and economic decline, a vicious cycle that can drag on for centuries before easing up. Plus, indirect effects. This impact runs really deep, too. As plagues rage, people lose faith in most social groups, but the Christian church gains power. Unlike other religions, caring for the sick is a core Christian duty, helping folks deal with trauma during disasters, which was key to Christianity's global spread. Next up, we'll cover how plagues ravaged Europe between 1200 and 1500 AD. This terrifying plague is the bubonic plague. After infection, plague victims suffer body aches, swollen lymph nodes, coughing blood, and often die within 3 days. The 14th century, Italian writer Boccaccio described plague symptoms in his novel, The Decorum, like this. In both men and women, a swelling first pops up in the groin or armpit, growing bigger to the size of a small apple or egg. Then the symptoms shift, with black or purple spots appearing on arms, legs, and other body parts, sometimes as sparse, large patches. Sometimes densely packed, plague victims' bodies turned black after death. That's why plague got its other name, the Black Death. Actually, before this, plague had already been endemic in several regions. Even in Europe, plague broke out in the 8th century AD, but then vanished. Until the 14th century, when plague ravaged Europe again, this time destructively. And why such a difference? What exactly happened? Author McNeil argues the Mongols who conquered Eurasia must bear responsibility. Scientists proved fleas carry deadly Yersinia pestis bacteria, with rodents, like rats, as primary hosts. Since fleas and rats can't fly or swim, plague was previously contained regionally. But when the Mongols rose under Genghis Khan and his descendants, their cavalry swept across Eurasia, inevitably contacting wild rodents on the steppes. Their lightning campaigns crossed disease circles and geographical barriers. For plague transmission, barriers became surmountable. Infected rats, fleas, and humans spread the bacteria to new rodent communities, continuing westward along the steppes, ultimately causing Europe's 14th century Black Death. That 14th century plague was history's most devastating pandemic with extraordinary mortality, wiping out 1/3 of the population. So, beyond population devastation, what other impacts did it have? Psychologically, death's fear permeated society. People felt depressed and lost, with daily norms collapsing. To combat fear, extreme measures emerged, like in 14th century Western Europe, where people saw plague as God's punishment. To appease God's anger, Jews became scapegoats violently targeted. Culturally, plague spawned classic literary and artistic works. For example, the Decameron shows the terror plague inflicted. Many painters adopted darker styles. Disaster, horror, and death themes permeated artworks. Economically, although conflicts between social classes intensified, surprisingly, the plague actually improved the lower classes' situation to some extent. Why? The reason is too many people died, leading to a severe labor shortage. Since labor shifted to a seller's market, hired workers naturally gained bargaining power with employers. Religiously, people began asking, if the plague is God's punishment, why do some die while others survive? Such unfairness made God's justice seem elusive. Previously, the church bestowed God's grace through sacraments, but the plague struck suddenly, leaving no time for sacraments before death, so it couldn't heal the masses' psychological trauma. This led believers to question the church's authority. Europe saw the rise of many religious heresies, paving the way for Martin Luther's Reformation. You see, from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, Europe underwent massive changes, not all driven by the plague, but undeniably, the plague's spread and how people responded brought epochal transformation to Europe. Since the plague had such a major impact in Europe, what diseases held similar status on other continents? This brings us to the disease that devastated Native Americans for 2 centuries after the Age of Discovery. In 1520, smallpox. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico with just 600 men, despite its millions of inhabitants. The deadly killer they brought was smallpox from Europe. In this battle, the Spanish were initially repelled, but smallpox began spreading in Mexico City. But the Aztec emperor and many soldiers contracted smallpox. Symptoms include high fever, headache, skin rashes, pustules, and complications like sepsis, meningitis, and pneumonia. The mortality rate within 20 days of infection was as high as 30%. If you survived, smallpox left permanent marks, pockmarks from the scabbed pustules. In the past, anyone with pockmarks was a lucky smallpox survivor. Emperor Kangxi could ascend the throne partly because he had pockmarks, showing he'd escaped smallpox and had immunity. The Aztecs weren't so lucky. Many warriors died quickly, forced to watch Cortés regroup and counterattack. Ultimately, Mexico City was destroyed, the Aztec Empire fell, and their civilization ended. Smallpox claimed 1/3 of the empire's lives. And what battle was even possible? Why smallpox? The Spanish couldn't have won this lopsided war otherwise. We all know this was 2 disease circles colliding, one crushing the other. But why weren't the Spanish troubled by American diseases? Why such unequal disease exchange between the Aztecs' Americas and the Spaniards' Eurasia? 2 reasons. First, Eurasia is vastly larger with greater biodiversity and ecological complexity. So American species rarely won survival competitions against Eurasian ones. Second, America's domesticated animals like llamas and alpacas carried no special diseases, They were scattered in small, isolated Andean populations, unable to sustain infection chains. Thus, Native Americans lacked exposure to deadly epidemics. Simply put, Americans had lower immunity than Europeans. So, indigenous Americans were highly vulnerable to foreign pathogens crossing the ocean. Yet, when Native American deaths peaked, it marked new global disease homogenization, like red ink diluting in clear water. Around 1650 AD, after over a century of smallpox, Native American populations finally began rebounding. Later, inoculation effectively controlled smallpox, making it less terrifying. By the late 20th century, experts even proposed eradicating infectious diseases. It seemed humanity had gained the upper hand against plagues. But remember, plagues are a fundamental parameter. Eliminating them is nearly impossible. The seesaw balance is temporary, and the struggle will never be one-sided. However, in an era where humanity seemed to have triumphed, the shadow of plague still lingered. The global spread of cholera is a prime example. Cholera is a severe infectious disease caused by Vibrio cholerae, a pathogen that can survive in water for weeks. Its lethality is terrifyingly rapid. Infected individuals experience severe diarrhea, vomiting, and fever within hours, with intense dehydration causing them to shrivel and die quickly. For a long time, cholera has been endemic to Bengal, but in 1817, a major cholera pandemic swept through the Indian interior, with British ships and troops moving in and out during colonial times. Thus, cholera broke out of its usual boundaries and followed British forces into new, unfamiliar regions. Cholera mainly spread along two routes, one overland to Nepal and Afghanistan, the second was by sea. Between 1820 and 1822, it spread to Southeast Asia. In the 19th century, steamships and railways in China and Japan were well developed, accelerating cholera's spread from its origin to the globe. In 1826, a new cholera outbreak occurred in Bengal and quickly spread to southern Russia. Subsequently, due to wars between Russia and Persia, Turkey, and Poland, cholera reached the Balkans, then spread to Britain, invaded Ireland the following year, and Irish immigrants brought it to Canada. Then, the United States and Mexico also fell victim, with cholera deaths reaching millions in the 19th century. The deaths from cholera made people feel the terror of plague again, causing widespread panic in society. Um, Initially helpless, people later consciously implemented preventative measures, such as urban sanitation, medical facilities, and water supply systems to control the disease. Taking Britain as an example, when cholera first broke out in 1832, people could only let it run its course. 16 years later, in 1848, when cholera struck again, the Central Board of Health gained parliamentary approval and implemented far-reaching plans, such as eliminating pollution sources in cities and building nationwide water and sewage systems. Moreover, other major Western cities followed Britain's lead, leading to a rapid decline in cholera, a severe waterborne infectious disease. In cities across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, few people enjoy sanitary drinking water and well-developed sewer systems like Westerners do. However, with limited resources, locals have their own ways. After learning about water pollution dangers, they adopt simple preventive measures like boiling water before drinking and regularly testing for bacterial contamination. Thus, cholera outbreaks have played a significant role in establishing modern sanitation systems. Additionally, cholera has had another crucial impact, promoting the transformation of traditional urban-rural relations. Before the 19th century, cities everywhere were population sinkholes. Due to polluted environments, deaths outpaced births. Without constant rural migration, populations would dwindle, making sustenance difficult, let alone development. But by 1900, after public health gained institutional safeguards, urban populations grew for the first time without relying on rural influx. This is a fundamental change. Previously, because cities needed rural migrants, social mobility was one way. Now, rural migrants face restrictions like job competition and housing issues, leading to inevitable conflicts between urban and rural areas. Meanwhile, more rural areas are also embarking on urbanization. Urbanization and the transformation of urban rural relations can be said to be the fundamental thread of global development since the 20th century. And so, behind this thread lies the control and management of cholera by Europeans since the 19th century. You see, in the 19th century, cholera first became a global pandemic through new transportation. And after the disaster, it was effectively curbed by new public health measures. Um, it's no exaggeration to say that the entire history of the 19th century is encapsulated in this disease. This is the history of plagues from prehistoric times to the 20th century, from plague to smallpox to cholera, highlighting their impact on human history. The modern disease pattern we're in now was established after the 18th century. In this pattern, humans and microbes had maintained a new equilibrium, forming a coexistence. However, humanity's vulnerability to plagues cannot be completely altered by technology or knowledge. Remember that sudden SARS outbreak in 2003? In the face of SARS, how many panicked? How many felt utterly helpless? That's exactly why understanding plague history becomes so crucial, doesn't it? People should learn the common patterns of past outbreaks and strive to predict possible scenarios before epidemics strike. This is author McNeil's core motivation for writing this book. All right, that concludes our introduction to plagues and peoples. Reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.